So this is a what I think is a long overdue follow-up video to the one that I originally made when I had reached 90 days on the Nofap challenge. Um, that video got a lot of great feedback and a lot of exposure, a lot more than I anticipated it getting. And it seemed that there were a lot of people wanting to engage further on this and wanting to sort of explore some of the ideas that I raised in that video. That was about a year ago, give or take a month or so. A lot has changed in this past year. I've developed a lot more insight into addiction in general, but particularly my own experiences with porn addiction and relationship problems and, general, what I would actually use as a term, sexual addiction, the sort of umbrella term, which obviously encompasses porn usage, relationship addiction, codependency, other unhealthy sexual behaviors. So that's the term I prefer to use because I think there is some debate as to whether or not sex addiction and porn addiction should be considered the same. I think that's a complicated question, and I'm sure a lot of the people in the Nofap community would have certain ideas about that. Anyway, so I wanted to make this video to share the insights that I've gained in the past year, give a little update on my own experience, and offer some guidance or I guess some direction to those who feel that they still need it. So before jumping into the more general, I guess I'll just give a quick update on my own situation. So I had reached 90 days porn and masturbation free, I think last November it was. And I remember that being a very important milestone for me. It had taken me a year or so, maybe a little bit longer, to reach that point. A lot of life changes, transitions sort of led up to that. And I remember for that entire year leading up to that point, I remember thinking that reaching 90 days, I was somehow going to be in the clear, so to speak, or the worst would be over, the worst would be behind me. The most difficulty would have already been overcome, or whatever. And I've been challenged a lot in this past year, and I think it's really reshaped my idea of what it means to live a healthy life, to have a healthy and successful recovery process, healthy sexual behavior. All these things have really my understanding of these concepts has changed quite a bit, and I have not been really too involved in the Nofap community. I actually made a conscious decision to stop visiting that website, and I'll explain in a minute why. So I can't. So maybe what I'm saying right now is not very accurate in terms of what's currently going on that subreddit, but I was there for a long enough period of time to sort of observe a trend or the sort of trajectory of the, I guess, atmosphere on that online forum community, and so I just want to so I had decided to stop involving myself with the Nofap community, in part because it wasn't really. So first of all, I was struggling with an addiction. I was not someone who occasionally used porn and wanted to see, if I would get any superpowers from giving it up. I mean, there are varying degrees of I guess some people's motivation for being a part of that community, is simply for exploring their sexuality or trying something new or doing something, doing this as a challenge for fun or something. So right off the bat, this video that I'm going to be making about addiction and recovery is directed to individuals who have an addiction, sexual addiction, pornography addiction. So particularly younger guys, because the older you are when this develops, you know, there are a lot of older guys, I think, who had already developed sexually and emotionally before becoming involved with pornography, and so they have sort of a different experience, may not be the same developmental process and recovery process. So, and then there are those who are not actually addicted or don't have a very deep-rooted addiction, and for them, so for those two camps, the Nofap community may be perfectly fine. What I'm trying to get at is that those who have a serious addiction, like I did, I believe could benefit from a community that has a lot more structure than Nofap does, a very systematic sort of framework for recovery, that an open message board forum like the subreddit Nofap does not provide. And I would go so far as to say that for some, engaging with the Nofap community can actually be destructive, and it started to be that way for me, and that's partly why I severed my connection with that community. So I'll briefly explain why. There are so many people on that website now. I think there are close to 200,000. I think when I first signed up and was making daily posts on there and really using it as a source of support in my very early recovery. I think there were maybe like 20, 30, like 15,000, 20,000 Fapstronauts, and now there are some like 170,000 or something. So the sheer number of people on that website inevitably breeds confusion, ideological ego battles, power trips, conflicting opinions, people who are there to just joke around or be dicks, so there is a wide range of interests, conflicting interests on that website. So there's that. There's also, it's one thing to say, here's my mission, I'm going to not look at pornography and masturbate for 90 days, and maybe that'll solve my problems, or, whatever mentality, very immature, unthought out mentality a lot of people have, including myself when I first stumbled upon that website. That coming to that website with that idea, there's not a whole lot of I'll come back to the word structure, because I think that's what it comes down to. There needs to be, for people that are truly addicts, there needs to be a much more in-depth process of recovery than what being on this subreddit would allow for. So, long story short, I am in part making this video because I have found in my own recovery process a number of communities and different approaches to recovery that I think are far more helpful, far less convoluted and confusing, and potentially detrimental than Nofap is. And so I'd like to share that with all of you. I'd like to share some of my latest insights about what it means to have an addiction, and hopefully this will be of some benefit to those of you who end up watching this. I had no idea when I made the first video that it would get this many views and this much feedback, and so I felt almost like an obligation to make a second video, because so much of my growth and development as a person has taken place within the last year, away from the Nofap community, away from what got me into this in the first place, in a different recovery community, with a different kind of approach. And so, I want that to be available to people who may still be kind of stuck in this sort of confused state of not really knowing where they are, where they stand with their addiction, where to seek support, that kind of thing. So I'm hoping this will be helpful for some people. So the recovery community that I have developed a fairly strong connection to, and I have to say first that I am no spokesperson for this website, this online forum. I'm a member. I was recently designated a mentor, recovery mentor, because I've been on there a long time. I've made a lot of progress in the past year of being on that website. And so recoverynation.com is what it's called. It is for individuals who are recovering from sexual addiction. That can range from extremes like rapists and hardcore exhibitionists to teenage porn addicts. And the principles that are used on that website are applicable to whatever sexual addiction situation you find yourself in. So I just say this so that you know that if at some point you decide to get involved with this community, there are hundreds and hundreds of people that are involved with it, and some of them have very different backgrounds than the typical person you might find posting on the Nofap website. So that's just something to be aware of. So recoverynation.com, it is primarily a workshop. So there are maybe, I think, 60, 70 lessons that, for someone who is moderately engaged in that and is not half-assing it and really taking the time to do it, but also not rushing through it, the 70 lessons take, close to a year. It took me, I think I started in November of last year, like right around when I made that video, I found that past YouTube video, I found the Recovery Nation website. So started in November, and I think I finished the lessons in May or June. So, half year, a little give or take. So it's a serious commitment, but it will provide you, if you're sincere in your exploration, it will provide you with the tools to recover from your addiction. So now the lessons are structured in such a way where the beginning is mainly about developing your value system. So this is something that most addicts do not have very well developed, or if they do, it is so separate from their everyday experience. Their value system is so removed, so vague and abstract, not very practical, not applied very well to their lives. So a lot of people don't even really understand what it means to have a sufficiently developed and functional value system. So the first part of the workshop is geared towards teaching that and helping individuals discover for themselves, for some people for the first time, what it means to have values, how to act in accordance with your values, how to plan your life around your values and make decisions according to them. And that is the sort of cornerstone of what gets people into recovery and what changes people's lives in a way that allows them to leave behind compulsive behavior. There needs to be a firmly established value system. So that's the beginning of the workshop. It goes on to explain really the nitty-gritty of the rituals that are acted out in sexual addiction, the porn use, the indiscriminate, sexual encounters, everything. So there's a section that really goes into the specifics, allowing you to really analyze your behaviors in such a I don't know what the word would be, in such a minute and detailed way that there's no room for basically you'll come to understand your compulsive patterns very well, and that's obviously a big part of the recovery process. Hi. So in like a couple minutes, you can come over here and okay, all right. I'm gonna have my partner when I'm done with this talking about the workshop and everything else I'm going to talk about. She's going to come and sit here, and we're going to briefly talk about what it means to be in a romantic relationship in recovery. So that'll be in a couple of minutes. So Trying to remember where so, the workshop is structured, so you've got developing your values, and there's a part on understanding your addiction better, managing your emotions, urge control, relapse prevention, all of this. So it's a very, very technical, self-contained kind of program. And, it's not necessarily the holy grail for everyone. I think for those of you who have attempted recovery in, within a 12-step program or something, and been sort of dissatisfied with it for one reason or the other, I think this will be a welcome alternative. And it is complete enough where it can really function as your primary sort of recovery domain, if you will. Though I do obviously encourage people with a deep-rooted addiction to also have a therapist and another kind of supportive community in addition to this online forum, because obviously that doesn't involve any face-to-face interaction. That's an important part of recovery, obviously, is developing those social connections outside of some internet forum. So but that's something I want to talk about in a minute. So the workshop is there. There are, let me see what I was going to go with here. So there are a few points I just wanted to address before getting into. I'm going to explain. So the workshop kind of spells out in the beginning of the lessons some common characteristics of people with sexual addictions who will continue to struggle with relapse and slips either pretty frequently or occasionally, and then the characteristics of those who will enjoy a healthy recovery process. And a lot of these insights are totally absent in the Nofap community. That's part of why I want to share it with this community, is because most of what I've learned in the past year, I never came across at Nofap. It was just too all over the place. There was not, and there have been some really meaningful exchanges I've had on that website, and there's a lot of great advice and stuff. I'm just saying that there's not as much that you can rely on that website to sort of give you these insights and have them make sense in a step-by-step way that's easy for someone to follow and rely on. So first of all, before getting into that, there's just a few things that I wanted to mention. So obviously a big thing is in the process of recovery is to not measure progress in terms of abstinence, which I see a lot of people doing in early recovery, which I did. And, that was part of what made, when I made that last video, what made the 90 days so important was because there's this sense in which 90 days somehow marks where you're over the hump, or, that's the point when things start to get easier, or that's where the horizon is. And I think that kind of an approach can lead to problems. And so that's obviously a big thing to be aware of and to develop an understanding of, is that abstinence and recovery are not the same at all. That should be pretty obvious to most people, though for some reason it's not. And there are some pretty easy examples of that. Outside of specifically, porn, sexual addiction, we have a term for that in alcoholic recovery communities, of the dry drunk, who has developed a dependency on this, recovery programs, and has not really added any new healthy behaviors into their life, hasn't worked to really develop a better understanding of their emotions. They simply grit their teeth and white knuckle it when they pass by a bar, and that's how they live their entire lives, in a state of perpetual fear and avoidance. So abstinence is not recovery. You may live a better life if it's just abstinence, but that's not, if you're really looking for true recovery, it goes a lot farther than that, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand, particularly in early recovery. So I think that'll make more sense as time goes on for people. So I think I'm just going to go right into the points that are made in the beginning of the workshop, because I think that really covers a lot of what I wanted to say in this video. So those who will occasionally struggle with, now there is this distinction here between those who will continue to struggle with relapse frequently and those who will occasionally struggle with relapse. So I'm much more interested in describing the latter category, because the former is really comprised of people who are not very sincere in wanting to recover, which I saw a lot on the Nofap forum. You know, people who would almost laugh at their own relapses and kind of make a joke out of it and make it seem like a game or some kind of recreational activity. And so, you know, people who feel like they've been forced into recovery for some reason, you know, legal consequences, you know, if there are any kind of expectations of them from a partner or any other, you know, social expectations. So people whose motivation to recover does not come from themselves, but rather some outside entity. People who minimize their behavior and say, well, it's not that bad, you know, it's not an addiction, you know, denial and all that stuff. People who believe that there's something inherently wrong with them, that they're uniquely defective, that they're damaged human beings, that they'll always be damaged, the sense of permanency of the problem that they're having. People who believe that, you know, the problems they're experiencing are somehow already determined, and they kind of have this fatalistic, you know, negative view of their future. So all of these characteristics are people that are going to continue to struggle with relapse and slips and compulsive sexual behavior for probably quite a while, until some core part of them changes. So that camp is kind of, I'm not really talking about those people, because they're going to need a lot more than just a little nudge in the right direction to really succeed in their recovery. So what I'm going to talk about is people who are sincere in their desire to recover, but whose beliefs, some of their beliefs may not be serving them. You know, so people who actually do want to recover and are willing to make the effort, but who maybe their efforts are being directed in the wrong places, or certain beliefs they have are holding them back. So I'm going to go through some of those characteristics here. Now, this is all in the workshop on Recovery Nation. I'm going to describe and explain and expand upon a few of these in case not everyone decides to visit that website and check it out. So again, you can see all of this on that website. So the first characteristic is that they often jump from addiction to addiction, and are particularly susceptible to hyper-religiosity or hyper-recovery, or both. And so this, I think, is pretty common, where there is a kind of euphoria when an individual makes the commitment to recover from their addiction, and that recovery process, however undeveloped and unthought out it is, becomes the new source of excitement. And either that, or someone who, you know, finds some spiritual connection and thinks that is their way out of addiction, and almost develops a kind of obsessive dependency on their spiritual identity, which is seen a lot in 12-step groups. So that is characteristic of people who are still going to struggle with slips and relapse. Now, I'm not going to necessarily give a detailed explanation of why these characteristics indicate some kind of problem in one's approach to recovery, though I think some of them are pretty self-explanatory, but as you go through the workshop, if you decide to commit to that, this will become a lot more clear. Now, the second characteristic is that they believe that they're suffering from a disease that is beyond their control, but not beyond all hope. So the idea of addiction being a disease, I think, is it's highly debated. The belief of the mission of Recovery Nation is the belief is that addiction, when you boil addiction down to the fundamentals, it is not a disease that exists as some autonomous entity in one's brain, but rather it is a emotional immaturity. It's developed over many years a process of poor emotion management choices and habits and underdeveloped skills. So it's a matter of not being able to manage one's emotions in a healthy way. So that is not synonymous with a disease. Now, the problem with seeing addiction as a disease, because it's commonly argued that way in 12-step programs and in a lot of recovery communities. I mean, there are a lot of problems with that. For one, that sort of promotes this idea that we will forever be living with this problem, that instead of seeing ourselves as our future selves as people who once struggled, as healthy people who once struggled with an addiction, the disease model instead envisions, that when you're older, you are an addict who is just managing their behavior. So there's a pretty huge difference in the outlook and the vision of what it means to recover, if you're seeing it as a disease or simply poor emotion management skills. So there's this idea that we forever have to be fighting against this, that there's something to fight against, which sort of sets up this weird false dichotomy where you're fighting against your own nature, your own mind. So that's obviously problematic. There's a sense of dependency on, as I mentioned before, on recovery programs, and so that and there's also one of the initial steps in the 12 steps is to admit powerlessness. So that's another point here that's actually mentioned, is that perceiving powerlessness as absolute powerlessness over their entire lives, and they somehow need the intervention of a divine source or this spiritual community, because they're just they don't have control over themselves as individuals. Their addiction is somehow stronger and more strong-willed than their own will to succeed and to become healthy individuals. So that sense of powerlessness comes from this belief that addiction is a disease. So, long story short, because that could be drawn out for, and that debate is still ongoing, but I think there's a lot more. Not only is it more practical to see addiction as not a disease, but it really doesn't measure up to, I think, when you look at a person's developmental history and what happens in their childhood and the causes of addiction. It can be explained in a way that does not refer to some kind of mysterious biological, purely genetic process that in many ways kind of reduces recovery to symptom management rather than actually life transformation, which I think is a huge mistake and keeps a lot of people from fully recovering. So that's my rant about that. There's a lot more that could be said there. But so that's one characteristic of people that will continue to struggle with relapse, is those who believe that they're suffering from a disease. Now, that's not always the case. Obviously, there are people in 12-step programs who do have that belief, who end up, abstaining from unhealthy behavior for the rest of their lives. But I think the main point is that that belief inspires fear and avoidance in a way that makes a healthy recovery pretty impossible, and that could be debated further. But that's the stance of Recovery Nation. As someone who's critically engaged with that philosophy for quite some time, I'm firmly behind that, and most people are who have come across this workshop, or who have been listening to the debates in neuroscience and philosophy and biology about addiction. So that's another characteristic. I'm not going to go through all of them because this would take a really long time. So I'm just kind of sort of paint a picture of, I guess, the fundamental tenets of what it means to not quite have the right approach or belief system to be able to put compulsive sexual behavior behind you. So another big thing is, focusing on controlling past behavior rather than learning new behavior. I mean, this is pretty obvious, and I think actually this is well recognized in the Nofap community. It's about building new habits rather than fighting the old habits. So there's not much more to be said there, but that's a pretty common problem for people who seem to think that just not looking at porn is going to solve their problems. I think that's, I don't really have to do much more to explain the problem with that. Let's see. So one of the biggest issues for me that has in many ways transformed my recovery has been the issue of fearing triggers, fearing relapse triggers. So in individuals who will still occasionally struggle with slips and relapse, there is a tendency to fear relapse triggers. And so the idea, and that sort of goes along with seeing addiction as a disease or some process within you that is more powerful than you, is that when someone sees a trigger, instead of seeing that as maybe an opportunity to develop one's skills in managing the emotional response to that trigger, it is seen as a threat to their recovery process. And that indicates that the individual still doesn't really understand their emotions. They still fear their emotions because they don't understand them. So that's actually that's a pretty huge point for a lot of people, because I think when you're still in the fear and avoidance stage, your recovery is not very firmly rooted or firmly established. And this is usually characteristic of people in the early stages of recovery, where they're in every way possible trying to avoid any situation that would trigger an urge to look at porn or to masturbate, whether that be seeing something provocative on the internet or seeing some attractive woman in public that provokes some kind of fantasy, or watching a YouTube video and seeing some naked woman pop up. A lot of people put the porn blocker internet filter system on their computer. This is all inspired by a fear that one will not be able to control one's behavior when faced with a triggering situation. And again, that betrays a lack of understanding of one's own emotions. Because if someone fears their emotional reaction to something, then they don't understand it. I mean, one of the central points of this workshop is to instill the understanding that all emotions are temporary. And so there's never a situation where an individual is absolutely compelled to act on an emotion. Now, when the emotion is not fully understood and it's feared, then there is a sense that one is compelled to act on that. And that's often what drives compulsive behavior, is that fear, that lack of understanding where they see the trigger and they perceive an quote-unquote addiction that forces them to act in a certain way. But that's seeing addiction as something that it's not really. So again, this gets at the more fundamental question of what is addiction. And this is something that will become more clear to people as they progress in their recovery process. So that was one of the other main points. Another one is confusing addiction recovery with general mental health issues. So people in early recovery, any negative emotional experience they have, whether it be, anxiety or frustration or depression, it's all very tightly associated with their recovery process. And this sets people up to have unrealistic expectations about what normal life is like after addiction is overcome. That somehow that should mean that we don't need to experience negative emotions, or we're doing something wrong, or we haven't reached that point yet if we're still experiencing anxiety or sadness or fear. So confusing general emotions that everyone has, regardless of if they have an addiction, with the addiction and recovery process is common in individuals who still struggle with relapse, because there's not that understanding of these are normal emotions to have, but we as addicts have not developed the proper tools to manage those emotions, and so they're perceived as more intense than what other people experience, and they're also perceived as directly related to the recovery process. That somehow in the midst of all the urges and replacing unhealthy behaviors with healthy ones, there's this buildup of emotions that are just unbearable, and that kind of belief is can be destructive. So that's another point. Seeing life in episodes is a big thing, with beginnings and endings rather than like a fluid process of development and gaining more insight. This also perpetuates fear, because there's this sense in which, if you go through 90 days no porn and masturbation, you'll often see that period leading up to that 90 days or before that, when you were actively engaged in the addiction, as an episode that might come back if you're not careful. And again, that all that indicates is fear and a lack of understanding, and a flaw, a misguided perception of what addiction is. So it all comes back to the fundamentals here, which become very clear as you go through the process of recovery. So those are just a few of the characteristics. Now, there are plenty of characteristics also mentioned here that indicate that an individual is on the healthy path to recovery. And again, just even if some of these characteristics I mentioned resonate with you, that obviously doesn't mean that you are somehow fated to continue to struggle with relapse. Again, that would be to see one's life as somehow already determined, which again perpetuates the problems that I've been talking about. So it's kind of a cyclical process of problematic beliefs and the thoughts associated with those beliefs, and lack of understanding of emotions, lack of tools to manage the emotions, and it kind of just spins in that circle. And so these are just problems to know about, to explore further, to be aware of, to try to transform, and there are very effective ways of doing that. But I just wanted to mention those to sort of give an idea of what to look for when you are someone who's attempting to recover from this addiction and still encounters problems. There's probably a lot here that you could go into that would be very helpful. So aside from the workshop, there are a few other things that I think are really important. So for me, in the past year, I've learned a lot about my own history with my family. That I think a big driver of addiction for people is childhood trauma or developmental wounds, or whatever terms you want to use to describe that. And so a big tool in recovery is not only to have a well-developed approach to recovery, like something some kind of recovery community that's more structured than, Nofap, but also to really get into one's personal history and into your past and into whatever wounds you may still have. So for me, that involved discovering the recovery group ACOA, or Adult Children of Alcoholics. So there's a lot of literature out there about the relationship between dysfunctional families and addiction, alcoholism. So my father having an addiction to alcohol and living in a dysfunctional home growing up, I think was the primary contributor to my addiction and is the primary contributor for a lot of people. And so I would encourage those of you who are kind of at a standstill in recovery to both consider a new approach to recovery, which involves being a part of a community that offers more than Nofap does. Also to really start to inquire into your past. So for some people that means, working on family issues with a therapist. For other people, I also struggled a lot with, and still do, with social anxiety, which, so self-esteem issues and all these things that in many ways perpetuate addiction or drive it for us, have their roots in some kind of childhood traumatic experience. Now, I don't think, so for me that was typically neglect coming from my parents, emotional unavailability, which does a lot of damage to kids and I think is pretty widespread in our country. So my guess is that like a significant percentage of the people that would view this video, or a lot of people that are on that website, probably have something in their past with their families or significant people in their lives, or interactions with their institutions, schools, or religious communities that have impacted them negatively in ways that they're not aware of yet. So for me, that meant something very personal. For everyone else, it's going to mean something maybe similar or different. So that's obviously a huge part to recovery, is to uncover those problems. And a lot of them, relate to very fundamental early experiences. And so that often requires a lot of reading, finding a competent therapist, and not just, the run-of-the-mill Psychology Today, fresh out of grad school type counselor. So that is obviously something that needs to be pursued on an individual basis. Also addressing problems with, relationship issues. So I think a lot of times like love addiction and codependency go sort of hand in hand with porn addiction and sexual addiction, and so unraveling all of that and the implications of that in therapy, and there are other methods of doing that, but that's obviously something that needs to be focused on. It's not just a matter of replacing unhealthy behaviors with healthy ones. There needs to be a healing process that goes a lot deeper than that, which is why if you have any exposure to cognitive behavioral therapy, you might find that it's initially very effective for people who are actively engaged in their addiction and need to find some way to challenge their thought processes, to engage in new healthy behaviors. But I think what you'll find, what most people with any deep-rooted addiction will find, is that even after developing the healthy behaviors and leaving the addictive behavior behind, that doesn't address the wound that caused the addiction to spring up in the first place. So the real recovery happens when you uncover what that wound was for you. And what I'm saying is that I think that we as addicts in this society, I think, share very similar wounds, though they may be individual to our upbringing or our circumstances. And so without addressing that, and you'd be hard-pressed to find an addict who doesn't have those wounds to uncover. Without addressing that, you're not really doing the full work, and you'll probably still struggle with addictive behavior or an addictive lifestyle in one way or another. Transferring your addiction from porn to video games, or from porn to alcohol or cocaine or whatever. So that's obviously if you're not addressing the wound, the addiction may just show another face, and then you're not really doing yourself any favors and you're wasting time. And quite frankly, porn is probably a less dangerous addiction to have than heroin, so if you're not willing to address the initial wounds, you might as well stick with the porn. So obviously that's not something I encourage, but I'm just trying to make a point that you're probably not going to get where you want to get if there is not like a process of really reflective kind of inventory of one's upbringing and emotional life and development as you went from a little kid to being who you are today. So yeah, I think that's the gist of what I wanted to share. So I would recommend if people are interested in what I said, or if there's something that resonates with you and you want to learn more about that, to explore the Recovery Nation community and to do the workshop. Yeah, I mean, I think that's most of it. There's also, I think, so one other characteristic I wanted to mention, which is a big deal for a lot of younger people in recovery, especially from porn, is, and I'll read it here, is that significant others tend to experience these individuals as exhausting. These individuals meaning those who exhibit the characteristics that indicate still having a struggle with compulsive behavior. So those who have certain unhealthy recovery patterns will be experienced by their significant others as exhausting. And it says here, capable of achieving anything they set their minds to. So usually these people are very genuine and sincere in their approach to recovery. Though unsure of what it is they will eventually settle their minds on, the relationships themselves tend to be selfish, focusing on the quote-unquote addict more so than the partnership. While love and admiration and long-term stability can still be achieved, it is often at the expense of the partner's individuality. So that is obviously a big thing to focus on, especially for those of you who have an interest in, developing healthy romantic relationships, which it seems like most of the people on Nofap are there because they think kicking porn will be the resolution of their relationship problems, which is probably not the case. There's a lot more that goes into that. So I recognize myself to some degree in this last characteristic of being sort of self-absorbed in my own recovery process, even though I'm not really in early recovery anymore. I have developed past the point of a lot of the things that I was mentioning, which I was definitely sort of stuck in last year. So a lot has changed in the past year, but I do still recognize in myself in my relationship with my partner, which has been close to 6 months now, that tendency to be very self-absorbed and to focus on my own needs at the expense of her needs. And, that has caused some problems in our relationship. And I'm working on addressing that. And for each person, the remedy to that may be different, though I think it often has to do with solving, unresolved problems with attachment or wounds in childhood. I really do think a lot of this leads back to that. As someone who's partial to the sort of psychodynamic approach to therapy, because I'm developing an interest in pursuing psychology myself in graduate school, and so there's a lot of comparison that can be done to the different models of understanding addiction and psychological problems. And I think particularly addiction, there's a lot that points to developmental problems and dysfunctional families and traumatic experiences. And so often the characteristics that addicts have in their relationships of being self-absorbed, of being not the best partners maybe, is often a symptom of some unresolved childhood problems. not always, and again, for those who have watched this entire video, maybe you don't fit any of these characteristics, or I could be completely wrong about your situation or where your addiction comes from or what you need to do to resolve it. So this is not one size fits all. This is just an effective approach that I think should be shared with more people, that a lot of people are missing in their lives. But so for those of you who also have those problems in relationships, I was going to have my partner come here for a second and talk about what her experience has been being the partner of someone who's in recovery. Before that, I just wanted to mention to those of you who are in recovery and are having troubles with relationships, what I notice is that when you're in early recovery, and so this is my own opinion, and I think it's backed by a lot of evidence, but again, don't take my word for it, but I think in early recovery, it's usually not a good idea to be in a relationship, and that's in the initial couple of months of abstaining from the behavior and learning new skills and all of that, which is sort of where I was last year. So I think those of you who are still not able to maintain abstinence from porn and it's significantly impacting your life in a negative way, I think being in a romantic relationship right now could probably complicate things in a way that is not desirable. For me, before developing more confidence in my recovery and sort of moving through the initial stages of recovery, I was very, very much dependent on my girlfriends when I dated, very clingy, fearing abandonment, like pretty strong, deep-rooted fears of abandonment, just unhealthy attachment in general. So that's not going to lead you anywhere good. So if that is the characteristic in your relationships, then you most likely need some time to figure out where you're headed in your recovery process, and that is much easier done on your own. And I think there are a lot of lessons that are learned through being alone and accepting being alone for a period that are necessary for people who are very much active in their addiction. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be alone for a really long time. And I had made a commitment to be single and not seek out any romantic relationship for, I think, a year. I made that commitment in late last year. And the opportunity arose in, I think, May to begin dating my partner. And even though that went against the commitment I had originally made, these were sort of different circumstances, and I think I had progressed to a point where I was no longer really in that initial stage anymore, and that's obviously something that you'll have to figure out for yourself. But I think there are markers of where you are in recovery, and this workshop does a great job of spelling that out for you and showing you where to go with that. So Hannah, do you want to sit down for a minute with me? Okay. Okay. So Hannah.
Yes, hi.
Hi, this is Hannah. This is my dog, Penny. So if you want to just maybe, if you have anything to say about, either two guys who are recovering from porn addictions and are trying to also be in romantic relationships or be sexually active or whatever, or partners of porn addicts, or anything that you've observed in your relationship with me relating to my addiction or being in a relationship with someone with an addiction that you feel like is meaningful that other people should know.
Okay, I'm going to say something about our relationship that I think was good.
Okay.
Is waiting a long while to have sex.
Yeah.
We did that.
Yes.
And I think that's important just because I think that if you're dating someone who is a recovering sex addict, it can be really easy for that. I mean, sex is a consuming thing. So if you're with somebody who's addicted to it, it's going to be really easy for that to manipulate into something you don't want it to be, and then it ends up hurting you, the partner of the person with sex that has an addiction to sex, or some form of, an outlet of it. And I think that, I think just waiting a while is really important. It depends on how long you want to wait, though. For some people, I think it can be a long time, and for some people, it's not that long. I guess also depends on where the person you're with is in recovery, like where in recovery they are. I also think that, I don't know, I think you might have mentioned this, but sometimes in relationships with people who have an addiction, and that are recovering from it, that person becomes really, that their recovery kind of takes over their life sometimes, and that it can be really hard to be with somebody that is going through recovery like that, because it feels like you are the second thing, when it feels like, for a lot of times, you want to be like the priority, just in like some situations, and it feels like a lot of times that can't happen, and that's okay. It's just, I think sometimes it's hard to remember that it's not you as a person that's causing that. It's more just them needing to go through recovery. But I also think that people going through recovery are more likely to become like self-absorbed in that, in a really unhealthy way, and sometimes not so unhealthy, and then sometimes a good amount. I think it changes all the time.
And I think a big reason why it's important to voice that, particularly from your perspective, is because I think in a partnership where the recovering addict is very self-absorbed and selfish and recovery-oriented and not partnership-oriented, and if that becomes the norm and is accepted by the partner in a way where the addict doesn't realize that is not how things should be, then there isn't really any move towards a healthier mutual connect. It kind of stays at that point. So while it's good to recognize that is maybe indicates a certain stage in recovery, it should be important to keep acknowledging that is a characteristic of recovery that needs to be transformed, because it's harmful to a relationship.
Yeah. And if you're in a place where your partner is saying that to you, like, hey, I'm hurting because you are so wrapped up in your recovery, and maybe that's what you need right now, but I can't be that for you. And if you deny that, then you probably shouldn't be in a relationship, in my opinion. If somebody says, I'm not doing that, that's not a problem, it's just you. Either, like, that, I mean, there has to be some pretty extreme circumstances. Maybe it is just them, but, if you spend, like, a significant amount of time every single day involving yourself with recovery, and that might be something that you need to do, but if that is also taking away from the time that you want, and you told your partner that you would, spend time with them, then I think you should take their word for it when they say, like, hey, I think that you spend a lot of time working on recovery, and that's awesome, and maybe, like I said, maybe you need that, but if you want to be in a relationship, I think there needs to be some boundaries laid out between the two of you, like, here's what I have to do for myself, and I want to be in this relationship with you. If that's not gonna work for you, then so be it, but if it is, then you guys can find boundaries, what works for you, like, we take space from each other frequently to make sure that we can do our own stuff, and you can do your recovery process, and I can do things I need to do for myself, and then come back and like connect and stuff.
And I think another thing that kind of creates or perpetuates problems is this idea that recovery is different or needs to be like a separate thing that's somehow different from just life and developing as a person. And so I think starting to sort of merge one's conception of their recovery process with simply like living their life and developing emotional maturity, I think, is an important part of that, because it sort of brings a kind of normality and it makes things easier when recovery is not seen as something that you need to go out and spend time on, but rather something that can be worked on in just your everyday life through establishing a more meaningful connection with your partner, or pursuing something in your life that's meaningful. And so I think making the distinction between, like, I'm going to go work on my recovery now and then go back to my life, I think is a problem, and kind of makes issues in relationships more apparent, because you're seeing your recovery as something that is separate from you and your relationship that you need to go take time on, when really it's a sort of fluid process that involves a partnership if you're with someone and everything else in your life.
Yeah.
And so to bring it down to sort of equate it with just living your life and learning, I think makes it easier to stop obsessing about recovery and kind of take it step by step in a way that allows you to live a little bit more rather than be stuck in this recovery mentality, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you have any other things you want?
I also, when you were mentioning that recovering should be just a part of your life that you're living and that is involved in your relationship, I know you had relationships that were like kind of at least pro your addiction. The addiction that you went through was kind of like amplified that, or definitely didn't help.
Yeah.
And I think that if that's the kind of relationship that you're in with someone, I think you just probably talked about this already, but I feel like that's probably not something that's going to go well. And I think that if you are going to be in a relationship with somebody, you should right away set boundaries and let them know what's going on. I think that's pretty obvious, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we began this relationship, it was really apparent to the both of us that it would be difficult, and that it would be a process. Some people don't look at their relationships like as a process, and I think this relationship is very much that. Yeah. In a good way. And I think that, just kind of establishing what is going to, not necessarily what's going to happen, but what's to be expected. And it's awesome if, all of those things don't happen. Yeah. But understanding that it's going to be really tough. Yeah. Too. And it's a very different relationship than any I've ever had. In like a really awesome way. Yeah. Yeah. I'm
trying to think of. So, I think it's important for individuals in recovery to get a sense for where they're at in recovery, to determine whether or not they are healthy enough to be in a relationship. Because I think there are two main things that kind of get in the way. One is when you haven't separated the sexually compulsive behavior from your identity enough yet, it makes it really easy to bring your sexual experiences with your partner into that addictive process, which I think is something that you were drawing on. Yeah. That if you haven't done enough of the healing yet yourself and you jump into a relationship, that can often just reignite and reopen the very tendencies and patterns that you're trying to extinguish. Mm-hmm. So that's why obviously waiting to have sex is a huge deal, depending on where you are in recovery. But I think it is effective, in any relationship. I think not necessarily required always, but I think it's depending on your philosophy. So there's that, and there's also just the degree to which your recovery process interferes with you just living a normal life. Because I think a year ago, I was driven so much by fear where everything I did was in order to distract myself from my urges or to somehow ingrain a new behavior, because I was afraid that if I did nothing and sat on the couch for 2 hours, I would eventually look at porn. And so if I had been in a relationship during that stage, I think things would have been very difficult and probably not possible to sustain a relationship. So this started at a stage when I was starting to realize I have control over my behavior. I've been distant from that behavior for long enough. That doesn't necessarily mean that I haven't had any slips since I made that video last year. I have, but I'm not active in my addiction anymore, and it's been quite a long time since I have been, and so that allows me the freedom to live my life in a way that's much more normal than it ever has been, where I'll often go weeks without even having a significant urge. So in that situation, having a relationship is manageable because you're not constantly focused on triggers and urges and avoiding certain things and everything recovery. Even though obviously there are still aspects of our relationship where I think I focus too much on my recovery and my own self. It's much less so than it used to be for me. So that's the other part, is how much does where you are in recovery dictate how present you can be in the relationship and how much your emotional state is affected by your experiences, whatever triggers problems for you. So,
yeah. I also want to make one point about sexual interactions with your partner. As far as on your side, I think it's really awesome because I think if you're addicted to any sexual behavior at all, you having a relationship that's like solid. I don't really know how to like describe in terms our relationship. It's really different and awesome. But if you have a relationship that like both sides are aware of what's going on and you guys can have a sexual interaction in some way, it's really beautiful because it's not gonna be like watching porn, and it's not gonna it's very different, and there's a connection there that feels really good, so you can like retrain your brain in some way to like see that not everything that's sexual is related to your addiction.
Yeah.
And that it can be really awesome and enjoyable and feel good, and you don't have to feel bad about yourself afterward or during it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that is big. And that usually requires a period of being away from the sexual behavior to give yourself a break from it.
Yeah, because you definitely can use sex in a relationship as just another outlet for your behavior.
And, I mean, so we've been together almost 6 months now, and I think there have been 2 occasions where I've had 2 different slips where I looked at porn, and immediately following those, there was a shift in how our interactions went, both sexual and otherwise, and so that is obviously something to be aware of. That if you're still struggling with that, there needs to be some precautions taken to make sure that any emotional changes that happen if you're struggling with, acting out or having a slip or something, don't dramatically affect the quality of the relationship. And I think depending on where you're at in recovery, a slip doesn't mean that much, or it's easy to move on from that and learn from it. But if you're earlier on in recovery and you have a slip, that can often bring back the kind of patterns that you're trying to uproot, and then you need to be a lot more careful with how you bring your partner back into your life at that point. So, yeah. So this is over an hour. I doubt anyone's going to watch this all the way through. But if you did, that's cool, and you should.
It's a really long time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else you want to say?
Nope.
Okay. Cool. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching.
Woo!
Okay.